Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. So today I'm going to review the SIGI King, which is this beautiful sword which has all the characteristic of a feather schwert, and this is what makes it so interesting. So the first thing I want to analyze is safety, because generally speaking I take safety while talking about SIGI swords, in general SIGI feathers, I take it for granted. But this time I want to assure you that this is safe enough, for a simple motivation. This sword is sword shaped. Now, if you are fencing and if you are practicing HEMA since quite some time, you know that replicas tend to be kind of complex to fence with, because if you start pushing a little bit your athletic qualities into the fencing, so you start to be a little bit competitive, you risk quite a lot. Okay, so, but with this sword, this is completely different, simply because it is not a replica, it is a feather schwert. So let's say that it is a kind of a replica which has all the good pros of a feather schwert. So, and of a SIGI feather schwert, which means that it is really safe. It is extremely safe. I tested it this week, actually today also, in sparring, and I didn't notice any kind of difference compared to all the other SIGI feathers which I own, like the SIGI sword, the SIGI concept, etc. And so it is basically the same quality in terms of safety, so very good. So the second quality I want to talk about is related to, of course, its shape, because it is the motivation, because many people tend to buy it, and I did it too because of this motivation, of course. Of course, we buy it because it's cool. We have to say it. The main motivation, because you want to buy this instead of a standard feather, which is cheaper, is because this is cooler. This is the main motivation. But it brings with it some pros. So having the, let's say, material distributed in a different way on the blade, so in a way which basically resembles, or it is basically the one of a sword of a kind of a replica, let's say, makes the sword behave in a different way. So it behaves slightly more like a replica in this sense. So it moves around slightly more like a replica. It feels more like a real sword in a certain sense. And this is really cool by my perspective. Also, having a little bit more material in this part, because you know, with a feather you have a lot of material here and then lesser on basically all the length of the sword till almost the very tip of it. And having more material in this part makes the sword behave in a slightly different way, especially while controlling the opponent's sword, but more in a sense, in my, especially I relate this of course with my style of fencing, especially while beating aside the opponent's blades. So like krumpau, romper di punta or whatever, so beating aside the opponent's sword and doing something, this sword is really, it's far better than my concept and my SIGI sword at doing it. So this is really cool. Also, this is reflected a bit also when I thrust in the bind. If you screw up your action, let's say, and you don't land it perfectly, this sword helps you a little bit mitigating your errors in a certain sense while talking about this kind of actions. And so it helps you deliver your actions even when you do some kind of little error, let's say. It is a little bit more forgiving in this sense. Of course, I mentioned that you hit in a slightly stronger way on the opponent's sword, but of course this transfers too on the opponent, period. So this sword hits slightly harder compared to other SIGI feathers. And this is true. Now, I asked my sparring partners, of course, the difference is still marginal, but it's there. So my opponents tend to feel a little bit more my heat compared to the concept. for example, but the difference is marginal. Um, of course, you have to take this in consideration when you are fencing with it, especially if you are fencing with someone which doesn't has a lot of experience, for example. So it hits slightly harder. Take this in consideration. Of course, other pros comes with this. You have to consider them too. So when you are striking at the opponent and the opponent parries in a not good enough way, let's say, with a kind of partial parry, let's say, you are able to hit the opponent anyway. So this happened with my concept, of course, happened sometimes too, but not as much as with this one in these few days. So I will say that, yeah, again, hit slightly harder, take this in consideration, that's it. So the last thing I want to talk about is related to how this sword handles. When I ordered this sword, I expected, considering its shape, of course, that it had to be similar to the SIGI sword, so the shieldless feather. But it's kind of different actually. So my SIGI sword handles in a slightly more clumsy way compared to this one. So I find this being more agile than my SIGI sword. Fun enough, I didn't expect it. Actually, I was expecting kind of the opposite if possible, or actually I was expecting it to be more or less the same as my SIGI sword. I think instead that this is in between the SIGI sword and the SIGI concept. Now, the concept is very agile as a sword, generally speaking. It hits more lightly, of course, as I mentioned before too. And it is more agile, and so it is very good for a certain kind of fencing, so feint-based fencing, for example. The SIGI sword instead behaves in a better way in the context of a bind, for example. And this one sits in between them. I wasn't expecting it. As I mentioned before, I was expecting something as my SIGI sword. Instead, it is more agile, which is very good actually because it fits my fencing style. But at the same time is slightly better in terms of, as I mentioned, beating aside swords, thrusting in the bind, stuff like that. A bit more forgiving in the bind, so you don't have to be perfect every single time, especially if you are facing heavier sword, because you have to consider this. Not every sword is similar to the other, and so having a little bit more material here helps sometimes. So, in my opinion, again, handles pretty well, is becoming my favorite sword, and not only because it's cool, but because it's quite agile. So again, fits my fencing style. I tend to lean toward agile swords, but it's far better than my concept on the binding side. So yeah, it's a very good sword. In terms of SIGI swords, I don't want to compare it to like other productors or whatever. In terms of SIGI swords, there is a motivation why this costs more than the others, in my opinion. It is not only because it is cooler. I will say that considering that I tested most of them, that this one is the best one, in my opinion. That said, I hope you will find this review useful, as always. And remember to check my Patreon page if you want to help me in my work, if you want to support me, and of course, if you want to receive more of my content in exchange. Thanks for watching as always, and yeah, see you next time.